session is about deploying web apps natively. So if you're expecting a different session, you might be in the wrong place. If you are expecting this session, then you're in the right place. My name is Jeff Poremba, and I'm the Senior Manager of Software Solutions for North America here at Motorola. And primarily what we're going to be talking about today, fairly briefly, is what about the scenario when you already have an existing web application and you want to take that existing web application and you want to create a native application out of it. We've had multiple sessions where we've talked about RhoElements and the RhoMobile framework and how we're all about using web-based technology to create these native applications. So now we're going to talk about the scenario where you have an existing web app and how you can use the RhoMobile suite to create native applications. So let's start by discussing the anatomy and a little bit of history with regards to web applications. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time here. I'm not here to give you an in-depth history lesson on web applications, but I just want to do a little bit of level setting and talk about the different varieties of web apps that we might be talking about. Again, just so we have sort of some common definitions and at least you know where I'm coming from when I'm talking about web applications. So early on in the days of web applications, and in fact even today, you can find web apps that are primarily just static content. They're very simple. They have no data backend integrations. They're just static content, HTML, CSS, JavaScript. Very simple, very direct. Now again, early on in the days of the web, web app developers soon realized that, hey, a lot of times these simple applications are just not enough. We need to integrate with backend data. We need to expose that data. And so the early method was really to use what were called CGI scripts. Right? Later, we started to get a proliferation of different frameworks for writing very diverse and integrative web apps. Right? You have ASP.NET, Java servlets and JSP pages, Ruby on Rails, PHP. We have all these platforms now for running back-end web apps. Right? And of course, the latest sort of evolution, as I like to refer to it, is Web 2.0, where you really have a nice, clean separation of concerns, where HTML really is about exposing the structure of your data, where your business logic is in your JavaScript and your styling is separated out into style sheets. And what you'll also find is just some technologies like HTML5 and offline data storage now taking this Web 2.0 technology and having it being brought to mobile, right? Being able to operate offline. So let's talk a little bit about the three-tier architecture or model view controller that is really become a best practice in terms of architecting your web applications. Now this diagram, some people may debate whether this is true model view controller, but I think for the purposes of our discussion here, what we're really just trying to show, whether you call it three-tier or model view controller or whatever, is just that there's a clean separation between your view or your presentation layer, your controller or your business logic, and your data or your model, right? Just a show of hands, how many people here are familiar with the model view controller design pattern? Yeah, pretty ubiquitous. Okay, so let's talk first about porting static content, right? Again, we talked about one scenario being that we just have static content, HTML pages, JavaScript, CSS. So let's talk about that scenario first off. So first, let's take a look at a RhoElements project layout. And if you were in Rob Galvin's earlier presentation, he went over this a little bit. I don't want to redo too much of what Rob did, but I just want to, again, make sure that everyone has a level set of what we're dealing with. First off, in a RhoElements project, underneath the project name, you have two primary folders that are important for you to know about when you're porting your web application. So the first one is the app folder, and the app folder is where you are going to put dynamic content, right? Content that's typically data-driven, content that's going to be generated rather than static, okay? And this is also where you delve into the Ruby MVC framework, right? Then you have your public directory, and the public directory is where you put your static content. And another thing that Rob mentioned earlier that I want to reiterate is the way to think of RhoElements on the device is that it behaves like a web server. So it's like having your own personal web server on the device. And any, you guys being interested in web applications, you're probably familiar with web servers. You typically have this public directory where you put your static content. So again, public folder for static content, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and the app folder where we go down into the Ruby MVC framework. Now, static content in the public folder is arranged. You have a CSS folder for your style sheets, JavaScript folder for your JavaScript, images, HTML. You don't have to follow this paradigm. This is sort of put there for you as a default organizational paradigm. If you want to wipe out these folders and put your own structure in, you can do that. In fact, what I'm going to talk about first in terms of us taking our static web application and bringing it into a RhoElements project is you are going to basically take your files, right, underneath your public directory, and you're simply going to copy it into our public directory, okay? And I'll show you a demo of that in a few minutes of me I took a pure HTML5 app that our training department wrote and dropped it into the public directory in the RhoElements project. Now, after you copy the files, there's only two other steps that you have to do to enable the project to be run natively, okay? The first thing that you need to do is you need to go into the rhoconfig.txt file, and you need to reset the start path. Now, by default, the start path is going to go to the app folder, and it's going to bring up the start page, which is index.erb. Okay? So what you want to do is, again, this is the scenario where you have a static web app, a web app with just static web resources. You want to point to that as your start path. So in my example here, it's in public, and it's got an index.html page. Okay? Yours may be different. And again, feel free to utilize whatever structure underneath that public directory that you want. The other thing I will point out to you is that right now there is a bug in RhoStudio that if you open rhoconfig.txt in RhoStudio and change the start path and then save it and go to run it, RhoStudio is overwriting the start path back to the original one. So there's a very simple workaround. Just open the file in a text editor, make the change, and save it. It's only if you make the change within RhoStudio that it overwrites it. That bug is going to be fixed with our next point release, but right now it's just a little something to keep in mind in case you run into it. Okay. So step 1, copy the files. Step 2, set your app entry point. Step 3 is to remove the default toolbar. So by default, we provide a toolbar in our apps. There's a very easy way to remove that, which is just go to the application.rb file in the app directory, and you either uncomment or add the following line, which is @add toolbar equals nil. By default, it should be in that file commented out. You would just uncomment it, but in case it's not there, just add that line. Now, I will also point out another thing that you can do. I mentioned copying files into the public directory, and that's the way I ported this app that I was telling you about, the training app that I ported in. You can also choose to cache your files, right? So I'm just going to bring up the fact that one of the one of the core features of HTML5 is the ability to take take files and cache them locally. Right? So you can create a cache manifest file. You can identify files that, that you want cached locally, right? And then what you can do is you can actually take your start path and point it to a web server, external web server that's serving up those pages. Okay? So a little bit of flexibility here. Again, my preferred methodology is just take the whole web app of static content, copy it into the public directory. But I want you to sort of think about the fact that, that you also have some of these HTML5 techniques at your disposal as well. Okay. So now before we get into porting the dynamic content, what I want to do is just take a quick exercise. I'm going to show you how I took that, that training app and ported it into RhoStudio and just show you it running in a couple of different ways. So first I'm going to pull up RhoStudio. And actually I'm going to have two instances of RhoStudio running. I'm going to have RhoStudio running on my Mac, and I'm also going to have it running in a virtual machine running Windows 7. And I'm going to show you this because I want to show you how you can take this one web app and how it runs on a couple of different platforms and looks the same. Okay? So this is my Windows 7 virtual machine. This is the application definition that I created. And it may be a bit hard for you to see the files here. But again, all I did was take that entire web application and copy it wholesale into the public directory. I made those two other changes that I told you about with the start path and removing the toolbar, and created a run configuration. And here's the application running. So again, this was a neat little HTML5 app that our training department created. Okay, and this is seeing it run in a Windows Mobile emulator. And I can also tell you that we took this app, we compiled it to native Windows Mobile, and we had this running at the National Retail Federation show in January. So in case you're skeptical of what this would look like on Windows Mobile, this is in fact what it would look like on Windows Mobile. We had it on a device, and it was just taking the 3 steps that I mentioned to you and then building for a target of Windows Mobile. Now, we're also going to take that same definition, or I took that same definition, excuse me, and I put it into a project on my Mac. And I just want to show you it running in my Mac, my iPhone emulator rather. So it'll take a moment or two for my iPhone emulator to come up. But again, what I wanted to do is I wanted to show you sort of the look and feel of this, this pure HTML5 web app that was ported to native, both for iPhone and Windows Mobile, in some very easy and straightforward steps. So just take a moment while that's coming up. This is, by the way, a good illustration of why the Rho simulator is so great. You saw how quickly it came up in my Windows virtual machine, and it'll take about a minute or so for it to come up, for my Mac emulator, or my iPhone emulator to come up. So I think the question is, can you run the iPhone emulator on my Windows virtual machine? So the answer is yes and no. So you can use the Rho simulator to emulate an iPhone on a Windows platform, but you can't run the iOS emulator on Windows platform. So here's the app running on my iPhone simulator, and I'm gonna take the the emulator, and I'm going to change the orientation. To give my machine a moment, it's weighed down a little bit with a couple of development environments and virtual machines running. But at the top of my screen in a moment, I should have an option related to the iOS emulator. Rather than wait, that will come up in a little bit. While we're waiting for that, I'll just show you that again, here's the application running on iPhone, again, with no changes, right? It was just the exact same application dropped into the public directory, 2 small changes, compile for the target. So again, at NRF, what we had was a Motorola device running Windows Mobile. We had an iPhone, and we ran them side by side. Again, the same app that was pure web app ported for native. Okay. Okay. So that was porting static content, right? So, that's kind of a neat trick, right? It's nice if you have a web app like this training app that I showed you, where you have all static content. It's all HTML, CSS, JavaScript. But let's be honest here. Typically, your web apps are going to be more complex. A lot of times, they're going to involve some back-end data integration, right? Very often, the real-world scenario is that it's not going to be that easy, right? You'll have server-side logic, data definitions, generated HTML. So let's take a look at these pieces one by one and see what our approach is in a more complicated scenario. So first, let's talk about some web app considerations. First of all, is that typically resources are referred to using relative URLs, right? And this is important because, remember, we're talking about having our own little web server kind of running on the device. So what we want to do is we want to stay away from absolute URLs because they'll continue to call out. But if you've architected your application with relative URLs, which I'm sure you all do, but I just wanted to state this, then you should be fine in terms of moving the application from your public directory into ours. Okay. Second is let's talk about business logic, right? So typically, if you have a web app with dynamic content, your business logic is probably going to be a combination of client-side JavaScript and back-end server-type pages, right? So it might be in PHP pages or JSP, ASP.NET, Ruby, right? You probably have some level of business logic in these server-side pages. Then finally, data. Now, analyzing the data in your application and the flow of your data is the most fundamental aspect of architecting your application. I didn't give too much of a background about myself before we started off, but I'll just let you know that prior to becoming a product manager at Motorola, I spent a little over 7.5 years out in the field architecting and deploying mobile enterprise applications. And I can tell you that over that time, I discovered as a best practice that when you're architecting an application, you always start with the data. You always analyze the flow of that data almost before you do anything else. Understand what data is going to be in your application. Visualize how it's going to flow throughout that app and into your back-end systems. So some of the questions that you need to ask, right, are what data can be cached locally and synced, right? Of the data that's used in that application, that web application that you have, is it appropriate for that to be brought down to the device? Is that reasonable, right? Or, what data has to be communicated real time with the server, right? Ideally, all the data can be brought down to the device, but there may be instances where you have to have a real-time feed. What APIs do you use to access your data, right? Are you using raw SQL statements to access your data from your back-end systems, right? Or from your business logic, right? Do you have an object relational manager that you're using? You have custom enterprise back-end APIs like BAPIs or something for SAP that you're using, right? How are you getting at your data? And the reason I say that you need to understand this is because, remember, part of what you're going to be porting your dynamic web application to is R structure and R format. So you need to understand what you have in your web app and what it's going to be targeted towards. So let's talk about architecting the app a little bit, right? Let's start with the analysis phase, right? Again, what resources need to be local? Okay, what resources do you have to have on your device? Do you need to operate disconnected? I think we at Motorola feel that a true enterprise application is one that functions offline as well as online, right? Or in what we call an opportunistically connected state, right? But you have a web app. Was that web app architected to be offline? Was it architected to always be connected? And do you want to change that? It may have been architected to be always online, but one of the reasons you want to bring it to mobile may be that you want to enable this sort of opportunistic connectivity. Okay? So let's talk about the design. Right? One of the design options that you have is that your resources may be accessed from a back-end server or locally on the device, or a mixture of both. Right? Remember, we talked about the fact that you can think of RhoElements as having your own web server on your device. So what this means is that you can point to resources locally on the device using URLs, or you can point to external URLs. You can mix and match, right? So you don't have to make a sweeping decision about where your resources are going to reside, which gives you a lot of design options, but also means that you have to take that into account. You have to understand, if you are using external resources, how does your connectivity relate to that? If you are using external resources, do you want to then put that in a cache manifest and cache that locally? Or do you want to just bring it down with other resources? If local data is desired, then you may need some sort of sync technology like RhoConnect. For those of you who were here with Adam prior to this presentation, you saw some of the great features that RhoConnect has to offer. But regardless whether you use RhoConnect, you'll probably want some sort of synchronization technology if you want to bring that data locally, right? Because you will want to operate in that opportunistically connected scenario, right? And the other thing is that in terms of design, and Adam also talked about this, local data tends to make apps look more responsive, right? Because you are grabbing the data locally from the device, and typically that's what you're waiting on in a web app, right? You're waiting for data from the server. So again, this has been a theme I've been talking about over and over again, right? You have your own personal web app server when you talk about RhoElements. The structure is modeled after early Ruby on Rails. For those of you who are familiar with the current version of Ruby on Rails has really evolved into quite a robust and at times complex environment right now. RhoElements is quite a bit simpler, right? Sort of traces its roots back to the early versions of Ruby on Rails. And basically what you have is you have view templates which utilize embedded Ruby. They're indicated with the extension .erb. You have controller files, right? And in those controller files, you have Ruby classes with methods. And finally, you have Ruby models or data definitions that are also Ruby classes. Okay, so this is the Ruby model view controller framework, and this is these are the sort of targets that we're going to address as we talk about taking your web application and bringing it into our structure. So again, this is This is sort of the fundamental structure. You'll have a folder with your model name, and then within that folder, you'll have those 3 types of files. So let's first talk about porting the user interface. Okay? So we've already talked about the fact that you can utilize static HTML as is. Your static HTML you can drop into the public folder. Okay? Now, dynamically generated HTML, what we would want you to do is we would want you to take that and convert it to our embedded Ruby templates. Okay? So again, you may generate dynamic HTML using ASP.NET or JSP or PHP or something like that. We do this on the device using these Ruby templates. They tend to be very straightforward. So in other words, taking your dynamically generated HTML, if it's done, like I said, either in ASP.NET or JSP or whatever, it's probably going to be a fairly straightforward conversion. Right? Here's an example of one of our embedded Ruby templates. You can see that for the most part, it's just straight HTML. There's a little bit of embedded Ruby script, and typically what it's there for is to do things like loop through data sets and pull data out of variables. And we also have a couple of examples of helpers. Right? Helpers do things like generate the URLs for you. So for example, you can see that in this anchor, where I'm setting up the reference, right, I'm using a helper called URL4. And what I'm doing is I'm passing it an action of show and an ID from my product object. Okay? So again, what this is going to do, I could certainly have hard-coded the URL, right, to point to my internal resource on the device. But this is a helper file to make it easier for you. Okay? So you can specify the action, specify the ID, and it's a little bit more flexible and generic when you create your code. But in general, like I said, there's not a lot of complexity to these templates. Right? Again, for the most part, you'll use the embedded Ruby to do things like loop through data sets and pull data out of variables. Okay. So let's talk about data. So again, if you want local data on the device as part of your native application, you can use our Ruby models. As Adam mentioned in our previous discussion, and Rob did as well, our Ruby models are very straightforward to set up. We've got 2 types of Ruby models. We have a fixed schema where you actually can specify the attributes. And then we have property bag, which is extremely flexible, where you don't have to specify the schema ahead of time. Whatever attributes you pass to that model, it saves. And let me just say that, that this is an incredibly powerful way of defining your data definitions. A lot of you may be used to other forms of data definition where you have to not only specify all the attributes, but also the data types. And if you get anything wrong, you're going to spend a lot of time debugging it. So I think it's actually kind of great that, that specifying your data models and using them in row elements is actually very straightforward. And it also takes away some of the effort that you'd have in porting your web app over. Right? Now, the back-end server logic, right, can either be called directly or converted to Ruby controllers. Okay? Your JavaScript libraries can also give access to local data. So in other words, you don't have to use our Ruby models for your data. There are also JavaScript libraries which give you access to the SQLite database and row elements. I would suggest using the Ruby models because they're very straightforward and so easy to use and really seamlessly integrate with the rest of the platform. But again, I don't want you to think that you have to use them. If you wanted to use some other JavaScript framework that gives you access to the local data, you can do that. I mentioned the dynamic or fixed schemas that Ruby models support. And I'll also say that the data that you have in our Ruby models is accessible through our object relational mapper. Okay? And this is fantastic, right, because it means that you're not writing raw SQL to get at your data. So again, a very convenient and easy way to get at your data that's been ported locally. Okay? The Ruby models themselves, as I said, they're pretty easy and straightforward. They support two types of data: string or binary objects. Okay, so you don't have to worry about all of the data types that you may need to be defining and mapping and supporting, right? So let's talk about business logic now, porting business logic. Your business logic from your web app can be retained in JavaScript. If you currently have your business logic in JavaScript, you can keep it there, that's fine. Your backend server logic can be called directly. So for instance, you can make AJAX calls to your existing web app server, or you can take that existing business logic and convert it to Ruby controllers or client JavaScript. Right? So again, remember that you probably have some business logic right now tied up in ASP pages or PHP or in a Java servlet, right? So your options. You can still call that server if you have connectivity, or if you're looking to migrate that, right? You have two choices, right? Either put that into a Ruby controller, and Ruby controllers again are very straightforward. We'll take a look at a sample class, or you can put it into JavaScript. Okay, but your backend logic, if you do want to be able to have access to it, disconnected, you will want to move that to your, to some sort of mobile form, either JavaScript or our Ruby controllers. Ruby controllers are called on the device through a URL paradigm, and this is also something that Rob Galvin talked about earlier, right? So, a few examples here. First of all, a typical template for the URL. You're going to be going down into the app directory. You'll have your business object name, specify the action name, which is also analogous to a method, and then you can attach the ID as well. Okay, so I'll show you an example of how this plays out now. So here's an example of a URL where you have app product show 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And what this translates as, show me the product, right, with the ID equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, any of you that have done Rails development, this is second nature. But if this is new to you, this is just a very structured, easy way of calling into your controllers and your business logic. So here's another example where the URL is just app and customer. And what there are conventions, right, that we adhere to. So if you just specify the business object name or the model name, what you'll get is you will call the customer controller, right? And you will call that index action. Index is sort of the default if you don't specify an action. Okay? So this is also an example where you don't have to specify an ID, right? Specifying an ID will pass that parameter to that method, but you don't have to use it. You don't have to specify it. So let's take a look at a sample controller class. Now I said that the Ruby controllers are pretty straightforward, right? Ruby is an object-oriented language. It's not all that different from other object-oriented languages like C# or Java. I am by trade primarily a Java developer. You have a class definition that inherits from some classes that we provide. And basically what you'll see here is that you have a couple of methods defined here that we call actions. Okay, so these two methods, index and show, these are methods, but you saw in the previous example how we specify these actions based on the URL. And in fact, right in the comments above each method, you can see that there's an actual example of what the URL would look like to call that action. Okay? Any questions about that? Does that all make sense? Okay. All right. So now We talked about the steps that it would take to port the app, right? We broke it down into porting the user interface, porting the business logic, and then the data definitions. We talked about some of the steps and considerations. All right, I've ported the app, now what do I do? Okay. First of all, once you have the app definition in RhoStudio, you can take that single app definition that you have, and you can now build for the native device targets that you want to support. So you can make a build for Windows Mobile, make a build for iOS, make a build for Android. We're not going to go through defining the build process. Those are separate tutorials and separate classes. We have tons of documentation on that. Once you do your build, once you have your native executable from that definition, then you can use whatever mechanisms that you want to deploy native apps, right? We have a tool called RhoGallery that you can use, but if you use something like Motorola's MSP or Afaria, or if you want to put it in the Apple App Store, all you have is you have a native app package that you can do whatever you want with it. So for Windows Mobile, you would get a cab file. For Android, you would get an APK, et cetera, et cetera. And then share and enjoy your web app. So in summary, static content is very straightforward and easy, right? It's a straight drop into that public directory that we have. And again, keep in the back of your mind that RhoElements is like having your own web server on the device. Dynamic content is trickier, right? There's a lot of considerations to bear in mind when you're porting your web app. There's no silver bullet, there's no magic button that you just push and everything comes over, right? However, what we do have is we have a really great structure for porting data models, business logic, and view templates because we have that MVC separation. Odds are that you might be using that same design paradigm, so you will already have your code broken up into its user interface, its business logic, and its data models, right? So all you need to do is understand what we need to support that. And typically, our requirements are fairly lean and straightforward. You can convert to our Ruby-based MVC framework. You can utilize HTML and JavaScript, or you can mix and match. You can take some of your business logic, put that in static HTML and JavaScript, or you can take some of your business logic and put it into our Ruby MVC framework, or pieces of both. It's one of the great things about our framework. It's very flexible. You have a lot of options in terms of how you want to do that. Treat the app like a local web server on the device, and first and foremost, start your analysis by analyzing the flow of data in your application. Great. Well, thanks very much for coming. I'll let you guys go.